covered in the introduction to Ezekiel chapter 38, both chapters 38 and 39 contain the sixth and final prophecy that God gave Ezekiel the night before the messenger arrived from Jerusalem with news to the exiles concerning the fall of the city to the armies of Babylon. These two chapters, chapters 38 and 39, give the details of how God will faithfully fulfill His promise to protect the descendants of Jacob who will be living in the land of Israel at the conclusion of the millennial reign of the Messiah. We come then to chapter 39, verse 1. The King James translates, "Therefore, you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal." God now reiterates what He will do to both Gog and Magog when they attempt to carry out their plans against His people, which God had promised to protect. He gives an ironclad promise. We've read it several times as we've gone through the material in the book of Ezekiel, that He will watch for His people. Once He returns them, brings them back to the land, He will guard them, and He will make certain that they are never again harmed. And so He's already gone through this in chapter 38. Now He reiterates it here in the first part of chapter 39. The leadership of this post-millennial army receives a double witness from God through these prophecies, which, again, remember, will be available to all nations at the close of the 1,000 years. People who live then will have this information. This is what's going to happen. Just like we today live at a time when all of the material concerning the Olivet prophecy is coming down around us, all around, and a lot of people seem to be oblivious to it. And, well, maybe it doesn't apply to me. Well, there are going to be people apparently then that are going to think the same way, even though the prophecies are here. They will read them. It'll be pointed out to them. This is what's going to happen very shortly. Because they're, unlike us, they're going to be able to count down that 1,999, 998, and pretty soon, you're at the end of the 1,000 years, so you know when Satan will be released, as we saw in chapter 38. We go on in verse 2, the New King James has, "And I will turn you around and lead you on." Now, the King James translates this, the primary translation in the King James is, "I will leave but the sixth part of you." The marginal translation in the King James, which is secondary, says, "I will strike you with 6 plagues." Again, the New King James has it, "I will turn you around and lead you on, bringing you up from the far north and bring you against the mountains of Israel." Now, taking the New King James translation, we find that God will bring Gog against the land of Israel. Because He says, "I will turn you around and lead you on." God says He will do that. Now, He will, of course, use Satan, the devil, as the tool to accomplish this prophecy. Remember in Job chapter 41, God says there, "I've taken him as a servant." He is a servant. And no one else is Satan a servant to, only God, because God has supreme power. Now, the context of not only verse 2, but the next several verses, does not support the main rendering from the King James Version. That is, "I will leave but the sixth part of you." Because it doesn't seem that way from what we read. The secondary King James translation, that is the marginal rendering in the King James, could be supported. That is, "I will strike you with 6 plagues." That could be supported based upon the material in the last several verses of chapter 38. Because it does seem that there will be one plague after another that God brings on Gog and Magog. Verse 3, the New King James continues here, "Then I will knock the bow out of your left hand and cause the arrows to fall out of your right hand." Now, the bow, historically, in ancient warfare, because everyone was expected to be right-handed. Even though there were lefties, they had to learn how to do it right-handed. Probably weren't as good a soldier as one who was born right-handed, but the bow was always held by the left hand. It was in the left arm, and then it was discharged with the right hand. Okay, so the left, when God says, I'm going to knock the bow out of your left, that was pretty much the way warfare was done, and the arrows will fall out of your right because that's where you're using your right hand to grab the arrows from your quiver and use it to discharge against others. And so God states here in verse 3 that He will completely, utterly disable the military offensive that is unleashed against Israel by Gog and Magog. Verse 4, New International translates, on the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and to the wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. What happens to the army of Gog and Magog will be similar to what will happen to the armies of the beast, as well as all of the armies of the eastern bloc that attacked the beast when he's in the land of Israel at the close of this present age. In fact, in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 17, Revelation 19 rather, verse 17, says, John says, then I saw an angel, and skipping down a little bit, he says, saying, this angel is saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and of those who sit on them, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all, it says, all the birds were filled with their flesh. Now that's what happens at the conclusion of this age and that final war that takes place in the land of Israel. But this is a type of what ultimately will happen over 1,000 years later with the assemblage of Gog and Magog. Now, back to chapter 39 of Ezekiel and verse 6. Tanakh translates, and I will send a fire against Magog and against those who dwell secure in the coastlands, that is, outside that area, and they will know that I am the Lord. Now, this indicates that not only will God punish those who actually set foot, who invade the land of Israel, not just that particular group. He will also punish all of those nations which lend any kind of support to the invasion of His land. Whatever that support may be, they will pay a price for being complicit with what Gog and Magog does. Verse 7, New American Standard translates, and my holy name I shall make known in the midst of my people Israel. There where my people are dwelling, I'm going to make known my name. And I shall not let my holy name be profaned anymore. And the nations will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. The glory and majesty of God will be fully displayed when He exerts His power to destroy Gog inside the land of Israel. This is what He's saying here. My holy name will not be profaned. No one will go against what I tell them they must do. And He will show it by all of like we saw in chapter 38, raining fire and brimstone and all down on that army and causing the same types of plagues that will occur with all of the armies at the close of the ages we saw in Zechariah 14 last time. Verse 8, New King James has, "Surely it is coming, and it shall be done, or shall surely take place," the New International has, "says the Lord God. This is the day of which I have spoken." God has now emphasized this event by giving back-to-back prophecies of its future fulfillment. This is, as he says here, the day of which He, God, the day of which He, God, had already prophesied. Now, last time we went back and looked to see, and sure enough, Isaiah mentions this, Joel mentions this, and Jeremiah mentions this. So all three of those, and that's prior to what John says later on, the Apostle John, in the book of Revelation. And so this is the day of which I have spoken. It's different than other days. Going on in verse 9, the New International has, "Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they, the Israelites who live at that time, they will use them, all of these war implements, they will use them for food. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fuel. And they will plunder those who plundered them and loot those who looted them, declares the sovereign Lord." Since God, throughout the duration of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ, of the Messiah, will provide all of the security needed and will not allow the learning of war any longer. Remember, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4 tells us, "And they will not learn war anymore." God will prohibit that throughout the 1,000 years. Nations will not have, Annapolises or, Air Force academies or whatever. It's not going to happen. The naval facility there on the Thames in Greenwich, the huge facility where they train naval captains and all, when the British Empire was the dominant, dominated the seas. It's not going to happen. And since God will not allow those things to be learned, and He will provide protection, it would seem here that the weapons used by Gog and Magog would most likely be as primitive as they're shown here. Wooden bows, wooden arrows, wooden spears, shields made out of wood or leather or whatever, things that will burn. Okay, so that seems to be the case. However, it depends on this how long Satan actually is given. He says he's released for a little while after the conclusion of the 1,000 years, but how long is that? Again, is it just a couple of years? Is it a couple of decades? We don't really know, but given enough time, okay, the nations could advance their weaponry beyond these primitive weapons that are listed here. In either case, those living in the land of Israel, those who have returned and their descendants then are alive at this particular time, they will gather, according to what he says here in verses 9 and 10, they will gather up and use whatever items that will be brought into the land when it's invaded by Gog and Magog. Verse 11, Tanakh goes on that day, I will assign to Gog a burial site there in Israel, the valley of the travelers east of the sea. Now that is east of the Mediterranean. Okay, so it'll be on the coastal area, the west coast of Israel, the land of Israel. It shall block the path of travelers, for there Gog and all his multitude will be buried. It shall be called the valley of Gog's multitude. So we're told here that the cemetery, when the cleanup happens after this battle, after God destroys all of these armies. The cemetery is going to be enormous. It will serve as a memorial of God's faithfulness to His promise to His people, that He would provide them protection. He would never again allow them to be destroyed and removed from the land. That's the promise, and again, we've seen that promise over and over. He promises protection, and this cemetery will be a memorial to that. This is what God did to protect His people. Verse 12, Tanakh continues, "The house of Israel shall spend 7 months burying them," that is, the corpses that remain of Gog and Magog, "in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land shall bury them. The day I manifest my glory," that is, when God destroys Gog and Magog, "the day I manifest my glory shall bring renown to them," that is, to Israel, "declares the Lord God." Now, he talks about here they needed to cleanse the land. Well, an unburied corpse, and when you go back and look at the law in Deuteronomy chapter 21, it states there that any time there is a corpse, someone who's a dead body, that defiles the land, and it must be buried. And so this is what he says. This same statute, ordinance, whatever, will apply then as well, because you must put a dead body under the ground. Otherwise, you can have disease that breeds and begins to spread. Verse 14, New International has, "Men will be regularly employed to cleanse the land. Some will go throughout the land, and in addition to them, others will bury those that remain on the ground. At the end of 7 months, they will begin their search." Now, Tanakh looks at this, translates this differently. Tanakh states that the search shall go on for a period of 7 months. That is, it will extend 7 months after this destruction occurs. The New International and a number of other translations, well, they'll be burying, and then they'll have to start searching. So either way makes sense. Either way makes sense. Because remember, in any battle, doesn't matter what battle it is, there are soldiers who flee the fighting and seek places to hide. Many of them will ultimately die despite not being killed in battle, but they will die from the wounds that they receive, or from hunger because they have nothing to eat, or exposure to the elements. They're still going to die. But they're going to die where they hide themselves, and so it will be the need to locate the bodies of that particular group that will require all the searching. The others are just going to be strewn across the landscape. And there's so many, it's going to take 7 months just to bury those, and then you got to go start searching for the ones that are harder to find. And so that seems to be what the intent is here in verse 14. Verse 15, Tanakh goes on, "As those who traverse the country make their rounds, any one of them who sees a human bone shall erect a marker beside it, until the buriers have interred them in the valley of Gog's multitude. There shall also be a city named Multitude, and thus the land shall be cleansed." Seems there are going to be 2 job titles here. They're going to be the searchers and the gravediggers. During that time, a huge group of individuals will be carrying out these responsibilities. Verse 17, New King James, "And as for you, son of man, thus says the Lord God, speak to every sort of bird and to every beast of the field." And this is what you're to tell them. "Assemble yourselves and come. Gather together from all sides to my sacrificial meal, which I am sacrificing for you, a great sacrificial meal on the mountains of Israel, that you may eat flesh and drink blood." In order for this particular prophecy to be fulfilled, there will be the need of carnivores, because it says that you are to speak to every bird and every beast of the field. Okay, so we're talking of animals, and they're going to be eating flesh. Cows do not eat flesh. when they have attempted to feed them ground up protein from other animals, they end up with mad cow disease. It doesn't work. Okay, God designed them to be herbivores. And so in order for these animals, every beast of the field, to come and to begin eating these dead bodies, these dead corpses, there will be the need of carnivores, animals that have the ability to eat and digest flesh. And yet God, remember, declares that after Jesus Christ returns and His reign begins for 1,000 years, that there will be no carnivores. No poisonous snakes, none of that. Not during the entirety of that 1,000 years when Satan is bound. In fact, let's go back just to rehearse this in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6. Isaiah 11, verse 6. We read, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf, and the young lion, and the fatling together. A little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox." Clearly, the lion is a herbivore if it's eating like the ox. In Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 25, Isaiah 65, verse 25, we read that the wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. And so twice we're told that during that time there will be no carnivores. Simply none. Once Satan is released after the 1,000 years expires, as we see back in Revelation chapter 20, he will be allowed, from what this tells us here, he will be allowed to manipulate the animal realm again, just as he will be allowed to influence the thoughts of humanity. All of the nations outside the land of Israel, they will be, fair game for him and his deception, according to what we read. It is clear that carnivores are the result of animals being manipulated by the devil. He has done some genetic engineering in order for what we have today in the way of the animal kingdom. There has been manipulation over the way God originally created them, because there's no indication that there were carnivores in Eden or on Noah's Ark. And neither will there be during the 1,000 years as we see in Isaiah in those two places, chapter 11 and 65. That establishes the fact that God created all animals initially to be herbivores, and likewise that God has allowed already and will allow again Satan to alter the nature and physiology of certain animals in order to have carnivores. Now, chapter 39, verse 18, the New International, "You will eat the flesh of mighty men," talking to the birds and the animals, "and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, as if they were rams and lambs, bulls, or goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan." It's going to be like a regular sacrificial meal, in other words. "At the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat till you are glutted, and drink blood till you are drunk. At my table you will eat your fill of horses and riders, mighty men and soldiers of every kind, declares the sovereign Lord." So God stresses here the enormous amount of flesh that will be available for the scavengers of the earth in the aftermath of the destruction of Gog and Magog. Incredible volumes of humanity, millions upon millions, tens of millions that will die in this conflagration. Going on in verse 21, Tanakh translates, "Thus will I manifest my glory," or my majesty, other translations would have, "among the nations, and all the nations shall see the judgment that I executed and the power that I wielded against them. From that time on, from the time of this massive destruction of the armies of Gog and Magog, from that time on, the house of Israel shall know that I, the Lord, am their God. The magnitude of what God does for Israel after the release of Satan at the close of the 1,000 years will never be forgotten. That's what he says here. Never be forgotten. Verse 23, New International. Remember, there's still going to be quite a bit of time. Second resurrection has not occurred at this juncture, so there's still going to be an awful lot of people who need a witness for what God did. He fulfilled His promise, just like He fulfilled all the others that He made. Verse 23, New International, and the nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin, because they were unfaithful to me. So I hid my face from them and handed them over to their enemies, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their offenses, or the New King James has here, according to their transgressions, and I hid my face from them. God will make known at the time of the second resurrection, during starts the white throne judgment period, that Israel's removal from the land had nothing whatsoever to do with His inability to prevent it from happening. They were removed from the land because He had to fulfill His promise that He would kick them out of the land if they disobeyed. That was the promise He made. You can have the land as long as, if you obey me. If you disobey, I'm kicking you out of the land. So God fulfilled that promise. But then He makes a promise, and we've seen it again many times here in Ezekiel, that once He brings them back, they'll never be kicked out again. That will never happen again. But what's happened in the past, that had to do with Israel's refusal to obey, not God's weakness, because God has no weakness. Verse 25, New King James, therefore, thus says the Lord God. Now, I will bring back the captives, or the Tanakh says here, I will restore the fortunes of Jacob, and have mercy on the whole house of Israel. And I will be jealous, or the Tanakh, I believe, is better here, I will be zealous. I will be zealous for my holy name. God now sums up at this juncture in chapters 38 and 39, He sums up how He will faithfully fulfill His promise to Jacob of restoring Jacob's descendants to the land that was originally promised to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. That promise is in Genesis chapter 28. We've gone over it several times, so I won't go back and rehash it now. But God did tell Jacob, you're going to spread out your descendants to north, south, east, west, but the time is coming, you're going to be brought back to this land, because this is the land I promised. God will accomplish His restoration of Israel in two stages, as we've seen. At the return of Jesus Christ is stage one, and then over 1,000 years later, through the resurrection that He earlier revealed in chapter 37. That's how He will restore Israel, how He will fulfill that promise. At the time of the white throne judgment, that will be when God will at last complete His promise that He makes here of having mercy on the whole house of Israel. Not just all of the tribes, but every individual descended from Abraham through Jacob. The whole house. He's not going to lose anyone. Verse 26, Tanakh goes on, they will bear their shame. Now the New Revised Standard has here, they will forget their shame. So they will either bear or they will forget, because it could go either way with the Hebrew here. They will bear or they will forget their shame and all their trespasses that they committed against me, when they dwell in their land, secure and untroubled, when I have brought them back from among the peoples and gathered them out of the lands of their enemies and have manifested my holiness through them in the sight of many nations. This will be done during the 1,000 years following the coming of Jesus Christ, and again during the white throne judgment. This will be fulfilled both of those times, 2 stages. In the vision in chapter 37 of Ezekiel, God revealed how every Israelite who had never entered into what's called the new covenant will be resurrected and returned to the land and will be offered the terms of the new covenant to enter into that covenant with God. Going on in verse 28, Tanakh translation, they shall know that I, the Lord, am their God when, having exiled them among the nations, I gather them back into their land and leave none of them behind. Note, leave none. That is, not one of them will be left behind, will be forgotten, will be lost. All of Jacob's descendants, go over to Amos chapter 9, all of Jacob's descendants will truly know God immediately after Jesus Christ returns. Here in Amos 9 and verse 9, God says, "For surely I will command and will sift the house of Israel among all nations, as grain is sifted in a sieve. Yet not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground." That is, God is making a promise. I won't lose anybody. But notice down in verse 15, regarding the time of this, I will plant them in their land. This is after I've sifted them and brought them back. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. So there's the same promise we've seen repeated over and over as we've gone through the book of Ezekiel. Once I put them there, they'll never be removed again. That's the statement. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 34. Jeremiah 31, verse 34. Because this is applicable, certainly at the time that they are placed back in the land. This will also be applicable in the time of the white throne judgment as well. Verse 34, Jeremiah 31, "No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord." Won't be any need to teach them that, because they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says the Lord. So it's going to be very evident when Jesus Christ dwells among them in Jerusalem during those times of judgment. Second day, in the millennium, and the white throne judgment the third day. The rest of Jacob's descendants, back to Ezekiel chapter 37, the rest of Jacob's descendants will know God at the time of the second resurrection, because here we read in verse 13 of Ezekiel 37, "Then you shall know." This is after he raises them up, the bones, the sinew covered with flesh, and then God breathes life into them, and then you shall know. Once you come back to life physically, you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up from your graves. This is a time of resurrection. And so they will know him, just as the descendants who are alive after the return of Christ will know him. Verse 29 of chapter 39 of Ezekiel, New King James has, "And I will not hide my face from them anymore, for I shall have poured out my Spirit on the house of Israel, says the Lord God." God will do this immediately after the Messiah comes, and again after the second resurrection. Again, here in chapter 36 of Ezekiel, verse 26, God states, this is after the time he puts them on the land, David becomes their king, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you." Okay. Chapter 37, verse 14, I will put my Spirit in you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it, says the Lord. So again, getting back here to chapter 39, 29, I will not hide my face from them anymore. I shall have poured out my Spirit on the house of Israel. And he does it, both at the return of Jesus Christ for that group, for the continuation of his descendants that lived through the time of the day of the Lord, and then those who are raised up from the dead at the time of the second resurrection. Now, the final 9 chapters of Ezekiel compose the second to last chronologically dated message that God gave Ezekiel. The last chronologically dated message was included in the 6 prophecies that God gave against Egypt back in chapter 27. And so that's where the last one was. And so what we, beginning here in chapter 40 through chapter 48, all of this is, again, dated the second to last of the prophetic messages. This material in these 9 chapters is divided into 4 sections. The first, which extends from chapter 40, verse 5 through chapter 42, is a description, and including the measurements of the physical temple during the millennium. That is the millennial temple that will be built in Jerusalem. The second section is about the return of God's glory to the temple. Remember, earlier in Ezekiel, God removed the glory. Well, now he comes full circle, and now after talking about it being removed back in the days of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, now it's being returned. And that is covered in chapter 43, the first 9 verses. The third section is includes the temple regulations, how the temple will be operated through the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And that extends from chapter 43, verse 10, through chapter 46. And then finally, the fourth section in this last prophetic message gives the millennial features of the land and of the people of Israel in the land. And again, that is the last 2 chapters, chapters 47 and 48. All right, chapter 40 then, verse 1, New King James. In the 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was captured, on the very same day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. And so we find that Ezekiel is given another vision. Just like he had the vision that began Ezekiel, seeing things that God took him different places in vision to see. The time of this prophecy would overlap 573, 572 BC. That's the time frame of when this prophecy was given to Ezekiel. The significance of the timing of this particular message when it was delivered has been viewed from 2 different perspectives. Both are feasible, although I believe the second is the most accurate for what we find in this material that proceeds throughout the rest of the book. The first perspective of the way this is figured is that the beginning of the year here, it says at the beginning, in our 25th year of captivity, at the beginning of the year. Well, in the beginning of the year could refer to the beginning of the religious year of the Jews, which is in the springtime, which is also the first month of the Babylonian calendar. So that would be the beginning of the year of the calendar in Babylon, and Ezekiel was in Babylon. The people that he was in direct contact with were exiles. They were in Babylon. And so they were using a Babylonian calendar. If that's the case, then when it says here that on the 10th day of the month, what would that be? Well, the 10th day of the month, Nisan, or as it was in the Hebrew, Aviv. it was on the 10th day of the month, remember, that the people were to have taken a lamb, and they were to keep that lamb up until the time that the Passover lamb was to be slaughtered. Okay, so the 10th day was the beginning of Passover preparation, if you will, for Israel. That can make some sense. Jewish tradition, the second perspective, which I believe is what this is talking about here, Jewish tradition maintains that the first vision of Ezekiel, back in chapter 1, beginning in verses 1 and 2, which dealt with the movement of the glory of God, came to Ezekiel in the 30th year of the last Jubilee that would be celebrated in the land of Israel. It was the 30th year. It talks about in the 30th year. Could be the 30th year from the covenant that Josiah made with God. Been 30 years since that happened. And then again, which makes sense because that would have been the final year of a Jubilee and the beginning of the new Jubilee cycle. And so it would come to the 30th year, be the 30th year. Okay. That was also, remember, the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile. It was in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile. So the 30th year was the 5th year. Now, since it's now, according to verse 1 here, it's the 25th year of exile, 20 years have elapsed. And so if you go back to, the 5th year, it was the 30th year, the 25th year, 20 years later, would have been year 50. That means that the day of this vision, on the 10th day of the 7th month, would have been the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement, which was the beginning of the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. Remember, Leviticus chapter 25 tells us that the trumpet is blown and the Jubilee begins on the Day of Atonement. That's when it begins, the Day of Atonement. So that would mean that this came on the Day of Atonement. Now, since the Jubilee year marked the time of restoration, everybody returned to their land, this is restored to this person and that person, and all debts are canceled. So we have a time of great restoration at the Jubilee. And since the Jubilee marked that time of restoration, and the content of this vision details some of the steps that are needed for the complete restoration of Israel to God, I do believe that the second of the two perspectives seems the most probable, that the beginning of the year was the beginning of the civil year in the 7th month, not the beginning of the religious or sacred year in the spring. Now, verse 2, in the visions of God, He took me into the land of Israel. Because remember, Ezekiel was in exile. He was down there south of the city of Babylon. And so in the vision, he goes to the land of Israel. He set me on a very high mountain. On it, toward the south, was something like the structure, or the Tanakh has, something like the outline of a city. Both Solomon's temple and the temple of Zerubbabel, which was also known as the Herodian temple, because Herod the Great, remember, went in. He did not care for the way the architecture was done. He completely remodeled the temple area, and it came to be known as the Herodian temple. Well, it was the refurbished, if you will, Zerubbabel temple. There have only been two. Hence the reason the Jews talk about the third temple and point to Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, where it talks about this temple. This millennial temple will probably be located the same place that the temple of Solomon and the temple of Zerubbabel was located, which was on Mount Moriah. That was the location. However, the elevation of Mount Moriah will probably be altered. It will probably rise be raised to a higher elevation, because Zechariah definitely gives us indication of that, and Isaiah possibly is giving us that indication as well, that there will be topographical changes in the land of Israel. Back in Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah 2 verse 2, now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills. Now, the primary focus of this prophecy, as we all know, is on the governmental structure of God. That is, it will be in complete authority over all other nations or governments, that is, large nations, as well as the smaller hills being smaller nations. All right, so that's the primary, but this could also depict a topographical change in the area where Jerusalem is located, which Zechariah adds a very resounding confirmation in chapter 14 of Zechariah. Here in Zechariah 14 and verse 4, and in that day, this is after the armies are destroyed that we read about earlier, where all the birds come and feast upon the bodies, the corpses. In that day, his feet, the feet of the Messiah, will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two. How? From east to west, making a very large valley, that is, between the two parts. Half of the mountain shall remove to the north, and half toward the south. Now, at the time of the great earthquake, which causes this cleavage, other movement of land must occur, because physics will still operate then just as physics operates now. You cannot just simply pop this mountain apart without other topographical things going on, things taking place under the ground. Since the Mount of Olives is located east of Mount Moriah and is split, according to this verse, on an east-west line, because part goes north, part goes south. All right, so you've got an east-west line. There's a valley here. So what causes it? Well, it seems most plausible that the most plausible reason for the Mount of Olives to be pushed apart is something being thrust up from down below. You have substrata that's moving upward, and it's causing this split. It's like you take a splitting maul and hit a piece of wood. It splits in two because the maul pushes, and you have a splitting. Well, in the earth, when you have certain rock formations that are pushed up from volcanic activity, it causes things up above to split. So it seems that there will be some substrata that moves below Mount Moriah, and it continues. It's just barely poking through the surface of the earth now, but whatever it's sitting on is going to move up. And when that happens, the land on either side is going to start to split and create valleys, and Mount of Olives, being very small, is going to be pushed in two. That way, after the movement of the earth comes to a halt, the highest point in all of the land of Israel will no longer be Mount Carmel or some of the other higher peaks. Rather, it will be Mount Moriah, which is where the millennial temple will be located and constructed. Verse 3, the New International has, "He took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand." Now, the linen cord today for us, we would relate to a tape measure, one that you can wind up and you can measure longer distances with a tape measure. Okay, so you take that out and you can measure, 100 feet. There are 100-foot tapes. There are, I think, some that are even 100 yards. So you have a longer standard of measurement. And then you have a rod being, for us, say, a yardstick. okay, because this is for shorter measurements. A similar vision was given to Zechariah here in Zechariah chapter 2, and it concerned the entire city of Jerusalem after the Messiah returns. Here in verse 1 of Zechariah 2, it says, "Then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand." Not a rod, but a line. This is something to cover a greater distance. "So I said, 'Where are you going?' And he said to me, 'To measure Jerusalem, to see what is its width and what is its length.'" Now, if we don't have time to go into it, but if you go on into Zechariah chapter 2, it's very clear that the whole purpose of this, I'm measuring Jerusalem to figure out how big the wall needs to be. You know, how long and how wide in order to surround the city. And then God says, don't waste your time. There will be no walls because God is going to be the wall. God is going to take care of any protection. You don't need a physical wall because God will be the wall to provide the protection. Now, back in Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 4, the New International goes on, "The man said to me, 'Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears and pay attention to everything I am going to show you. For that is why you have been brought here. Tell the house of Israel everything you see.'" This directive given to Ezekiel shows that the content of the final chapters is to be taken literally. This is not metaphoric of anything. It's literally. A figurative or an allegorical interpretation simply will not fit all of the details that are given in this particular section of Ezekiel. Verse 5, Complete Jewish Bible has, "There was a wall surrounding the house," or temple. The New King James has. "The man had in his hand a measuring rod 6 cubits long." Now, Complete Jewish Bible places an interpretation for us so that we can understand this better. "The man had in his hand a measuring rod 6 cubits long, or 10.5 feet. Each cubit," which the Complete Jewish Bible puts in 21 inches, "being a normal cubit," that is 18 inches, plus a handbreadth, 3 inches. He measured the wall's width at 10.5 feet and its height 10.5 feet. Now, the normal cubit was determined was the distance between the tip of the middle finger and the tip of the elbow, and it seemed to average about 18 inches. At least for the average person. There are people, obviously, whose knuckles drag the ground when they walk, and there are others that they're not quite so long, but the average would be 18. The handbreadth was the width between at the hand at the base of the fingers. Today, people are closer to 4 inches than 3, but apparently people had thinner hands then. At any rate, it's figured then at 3 inches. So the cubit that's being used here is a 21-inch cubit, which was a normal cubit plus a handbreadth. Okay, there are 3 different cubits that are given in the Bible, and for our discussion here, we don't need to go into all of that. Verse 6, the New Living Translation. Now, I believe the New Living Translation is the easiest translation to go through as far as getting it in our head, because it's still hard to figure out this cubit, handbreadth stuff, and for us to relate. But if it's in feet and inches, now I don't know, maybe the newer generation being taught the metric system, it's confusing to them. But that's their problem. I mean, for all of us older people, we like the feet and the inches. We like the British Roman way of doing things, not the French and the metric and all of that stuff, which I still don't understand. All right. So anyway, New Living Translation is the easiest translation to read, to go through this and to be able to see it in your head. So then he went over to the eastern gateway. He climbed the steps and measured the threshold of the gateway. It was 10.5 feet, front to back. So the angel began the description of the gate through measurements starting from outside the gate and moving inward. Ezekiel now gives the measurements of the walls and the rooms associated with the area surrounding the eastern gate. Because the eastern gate is, we'll see later on, is the direction, is where the Messiah is going to come from the eastern gate, through the eastern gate of the temple, to take residence in the temple from that direction. So he starts there. Now we go on down to, I'm not going to read all of this, down to verse 17. We get down to verse 17, and beginning here, we are given the measurement and a description, basically, of the outer courtyard, which, again, the outer courtyard was normally called the court of the women. Okay, so that was the women's courtyard. So that's described there. Beginning in verse 20, he then describes the area of the northern gate. So he comes in at the eastern gate, then he's going counterclockwise for us. He's going up to the northern gate next. Then he crosses the area from the north. He goes directly to the south, and in verse 24, he begins describing the southern gate area. And all of these gate areas look pretty much the same. They have the same basic measurements, the same alcoves, etc., etc. In verse 28, he describes the gates that lead then into the inner courtyard. It was in the outer courtyard, and now he describes going into the inner courtyard. Down in verse 38, he begins describing the area where the sacrifices were prepared, or will be prepared. So the animals that certain things need to be done. Animals have to be cut up in order for different pieces to be burned. Fat, remember, is separated and it's burned on the altar for God. And then the other meats sometimes were given to the priest, sometimes shared by those who brought them. So we'll get into some of this a little later on. Beginning in verse 44, he gives measurements then for the chambers that belong to the priests. Some translations put, there were 2 rooms, one for singers, one for priests, but the context really doesn't support that. The context is all about the priests who serve at the altar, and then the priests who are not allowed to serve at the altar because they're not the sons of Zadok, the ones who must take care of the physical requirements so that everything operates as it should. Verse 47 begins in a description of the inner courtyard. Then we come to chapter 41. Verse 1, New Living Translation. After that, the man brought me into the sanctuary of the temple. So he's gone around and looked everything over. Now he goes, past the inner courtyard to the temple itself. He measured the walls, or the doorposts, on either side of its doorway, and they were 10.5 feet thick. This 10.5 feet is everywhere. It's very, very uniform. Now, the sanctuary, of course, was the holy place, the first room in the temple. You have 2 rooms. You have the holy place when you first go in, and then you have another set of doors that separates the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. So he's describing here the sanctuary, or the holy place. Going on in verse 2, the doorway was 17.5 feet wide. The walls on each side of it were 8 3/4 feet long. The sanctuary itself was 70 feet long and 35 feet wide. Then he went beyond the sanctuary into the inner room. He measured the walls on either side of its entrance. They were 3.5 feet thick. The entrance was 10.5 feet wide, and the walls on each side of the entrance were 12 1/4 feet long. The inner room of the sanctuary was 35 feet long and 35 feet wide. This, he told me, is the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. So we find that it is 35 by 35. It is square. The holy place, that is the first room, the sanctuary, was 70 feet by 35, so it's rectangular. But we do note here that only the angel went inside the Holy of Holies. It says he went in. Ezekiel was not allowed to follow. Now, although Ezekiel was a priest, remember, he was a Levite, he was a priest, he was not high priest. See, and only the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement only, once a year on the Day of Atonement, which, what day was this vision given? Atonement. So Ezekiel didn't go in. He was not the high priest. But this is all future anyway. But even being a vision about something in the future, Ezekiel was not allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. Ezekiel now describes, beginning in verse 5, the chambers that were built along the wall of the temple. And I won't go through that. Down in verse 12, he talks about a very large building that was built across the courtyard. Verse 13, he begins describing the whole temple area and gives its dimensions. Now, when we get down to verse, let's go to verse 17. It says, the space above the door leading into the inner room and its walls inside and out were also paneled. All the walls were decorated with carvings of cherubim, each with 2 faces. And there was a carving of a palm tree between each of the cherubim. One face, that of a man, looked toward the palm tree on one side. The other face, that of a young lion, looked toward the palm tree on the other side. The figures were carved all along the inside of the temple, from the floor to the top of the walls, including the outer wall of the sanctuary. Now, it says they were carved into wooden panels, but what's interesting is that missing from these designs are carvings of open flowers that were included in the panels of the temple that were built by Solomon. You go back and read the description in 1 Kings chapter 6, and it talks about these open flowers that were part of the design on the walls, that were carved into the walls. But what's interesting is these cherubim only have 2 faces, not 4. And the way it is, remember, the cherubim are blockheads, okay, because they got, face, 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 and face. And so you kind of, well, they're blockheads. And so here we have, you've got the man, the face of the man, and then according to this, you've got the face of the lion. And so one face is here, the other face is here. So apparently the blockhead is turned sideways, sort of. And so the ox and the eagle are in the panel, behind. You can't see their faces, but they're not carved anyway. But that would be the indication, because we know that they have 4 faces. But because of the layout, for some reason, the ox and the eagle don't appear in this millennial temple. And there's no explanation as to why they don't show up here. All right. There were square columns, verse 21, at the entrance to the sanctuary, and the ones at the entrance of the most holy place were similar. There was an altar made of wood, 5 1/4 feet high, 3 1/2 feet across. Its corners, base, and sides were all made of wood. This, the man told me, is the table that stands before the Lord's presence. That is, before the Lord. That, of course, is the showbread table, because remember, the showbread is the bread of the presence. And so it's a very small table, and it's nothing here about it being coated with gold, like most, I think you go back and read the one that Moses built, and it was overlaid with gold. But this just says wood. Verse 23, the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors. The doors had 2 panels apiece, 2 folding panels. By folding, it means open, okay, not folding top to bottom, not some kind of fancy Dutch door, but rather they fold, they open, they're on hinges. 2 panels for one door, 2 panels for the other door. So you entered from the temple, outside the temple, the doors would open, you go into the holy place. The next set of doors led then into the Holy of Holies, is the way this is described. Now, the doors of the holy to the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon were made of olive wood, and the doors to the temple itself were made out of fir. So they used 2 different woods in Solomon. Doesn't say here, does not give us any differentiation on what kind of woods are used. The doors leading to the sanctuary, verse 25, were decorated with carved cherubim and palm trees, just as on the walls. And there was a wooden roof at the front of the entry room to the temple, or to the porch outside the New American Standard has. Now, again, the carvings of Solomon's temple included open flowers, which are missing here in this description. On both sides of the entry room were recessed windows decorated with carved palm trees. The side rooms along the outside wall also had roofs. So that brings us to the point to where we will close. Chapter 42 continues giving description, and we will finish out that section and other information regarding sacrifices after the feast, because we don't have another regular sermon time other than the Day of Atonement before then.